Good evening and welcome here tonight to this session, which is going to be brought to you by the CEE Bill Alliance. The event is going to be live streamed as well as recorded, and we've got some fantastic speakers lined up for you tonight. Please, as we're going through, please send us your questions, which you can put either in the chat box or onto the various social media platforms that we're connected with. Now, the speakers that we've got, and they'll introduce themselves more when we get to them, but just very briefly, we are Caroline Lucas, the MP, Tim Jackson, Director for the Centre of Understanding Sustainability, Kate Rayworth, the author of the hugely influential Donut Economics and now an advisor to the Government of Amsterdam, and Kimi Naidu, who was until very recently the Secretary General of Amnesty International. Now, just a few words from me. My name is Rosie Boycott. I'm a crossbench peer, and I also sit as one of the founding members and on the steering group of Peers for the Planet, which we founded about a year ago with the very express intention of trying to get climate considerations into as much legislation as possible. So far, we have managed to get climate considerations into pensions bills, so all big pension decisions have to think about what their climate impact is going to be. We have about 120 members, and just from listening and knowing and being around, we've moved the dialogue. Now, have we moved any of the laws? That's another case in point. This is really one of the reasons, main reason as far as I'm concerned, why I'm here tonight and why I think everyone else is here tonight, because we're certainly going too slowly. And I'm always very amazed at the moment that the world of finance is moving much, much quicker than the governments, because they can see that so much of what they're investing in is in fact going to be a stranded asset in a few years' time. And that if you made a 10-year plan, which any sensible business, and you'd think government would too, an awful lot of the things that they have their money in are not going to be working. And the same is true of the government. So we really need bills like this, which will garner support, push people into understanding the emergencies, and hopefully get through.
Greta Thunberg famously said, "Act like your house is on fire because it is." Well, pledging to meet net zero by 2050, as our government has, is like dialing 999 and asking for the fire brigade to come in 30 years' time. You know, we need the fire brigade to come now, and that is what we intend with this bill. The bill seeks to build on the successes of the Climate Change Act, which was a historic piece of legislation when it was passed in 2008, and it's been emulated all around the world. But the bill also exists to fix some of the flaws in that climate change bill as well, because on its own, our current Climate Change Act isn't ambitious enough or comprehensive enough to bring about the scale of action that we need. The new bill, the so-called CEE Bill, Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, was the brainchild of the CEE Bill Alliance, which is a talented group of campaigners, including those who previously fought for the Climate Change Act. It's had input from scientists at the cutting edge of climate and ecology, and my thanks go to all of them. But crucially, this bill is a people's bill, the people's bill. It's sprung from the grassroots with the intention of giving the public a real say on the climate emergency. So in terms of the key points of the bill, essentially it would place in law a commitment to doing our fair share of keeping global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. And that means recognizing that as the first country to industrialize, the UK is disproportionately responsible for the climate emissions that are already in the atmosphere, and therefore we have a greater responsibility to move furthest and fastest in terms of taking action to address that. It patches the holes in the Climate Change Act by ensuring that our climate change targets take account of emissions from things like international aviation and shipping. At the minute they're left out of the Climate Change Act because it was just deemed too complicated to work out who was responsible for which bit of the emissions. Well, that's not good enough. And so our bill would introduce and ensure that those emissions from aviation and shipping were included, as well as our so-called consumption emissions, the emissions associated with all of the things that we import from other countries. You know, the government likes to say that it's reduced emissions by over 40% since 1990, but that's only because they've outsourced huge swathes of those emissions to countries like China, which manufacture products for us, which we then import. Well, it seems to us that if we're importing and using those products, the emissions associated with their production ought to be on our accounting sheet, and therefore our bill as well would include consumption emissions. When you factor those in, then emissions have only fallen by about 10% since 1990, not the 42% that the government likes to claim. So this bill brings a bit of honesty and responsibility back into climate legislation. It also focuses on nature, on protecting and restoring biodiversity, because we know that we face an ecological crisis as well as a climate crisis. The UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, with reports last month showing that the UK government has failed to meet 17 out of 20 UN biodiversity targets. It requires the active restoration of things like our vital peatlands, wetlands and woodlands, which are really important carbon sinks. You know, the government likes to talk about tree planting, but actually peatlands store far more carbon than UK forests. I think they store around 5.5 billion tonnes compared with 150 million tonnes from forests. The bill ensures that steps are taken so that the supply chains of products that we use in the UK don't cause environmental harm overseas. It calls for a just transition, crucially, for people working in polluting industries, because in tackling the climate crisis, we cannot repeat the grave errors of the past, leaving communities behind. And there are plenty of communities, mining communities, former mining communities, that are still struggling in the aftermath of coal pit closures because no provision was made to support, to retrain workers who have been involved in mining. We absolutely need to make sure that that just transition is properly funded and properly supported. The bill states we can't rely on unproven technologies to deliver on essential emission cuts. And overall, it ensures that our targets are big enough and bold enough in the face of the emergencies that we face. Finally, though, it goes further, because what it recognises is that real leadership when it comes to the climate crisis actually has been coming from people, not from government. They haven't shown the necessary boldness nor ambition, and they haven't engaged with people about how we build this just and fair society which keeps within our planet's environmental limits. And that's why this bill puts real power into the hands of people. It establishes a citizens' assembly to deliberate on the difficult decisions and to put forward a new emergency strategy. And it gives people real agency by making sure that it can't just be ignored, by forcing the government to bring the Citizens' Assembly recommendations to Parliament for debate and approval. So in summary, the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill is essential if the UK is to demonstrate real climate leadership and galvanise momentum ahead of COP26 next year.
The Climate Change Act, good as it was in its time in 2008, is now hopelessly out of date, and that it's actually irresponsible, really, of government not to review its targets, not to review its actions, not to take seriously something that the Climate and Ecological Emergency Alliance has now put on the table. And this new understanding of the science of climate change was being talked about. And this, I suppose, was a couple of years ago when the IPCC report on a 1.5 world was first published. I was kind of curious, because here was a set of people who had no authority, had no political power, who weren't all the time scientists, some of them were, some of them weren't, who were actually setting out an agenda that was faster and further than anything that the most courageous climate act in the world had set in motion. They were saying essentially, we have to cut our carbon more or less in developed countries by about 2025, which is a few years' time. It's not 2050. It's not a target for 2050, and it's not an 80% reduction by 2050. It's actually basically saying that if we want to remain within the scientific boundaries of a degree of warming that is acceptable, that we can live with. In fact, if we want only a 2/3 chance of remaining in that world, we have to act now, and we have to act fast. And as a scientist, and I do this stuff for my day job, so I kind of got my spreadsheets out and I tried to decide who was right. And I started from the budget that the IPCC had set out, the carbon budget. It's a very simple concept. It's sort of how much carbon can we afford to burn between now and the end of this century if we want a decent chance of living in a 1.5 degree world. And the IPCC crunched the numbers on that. I didn't have to. And it's a if you want to know the number, it's 420 billion tons of carbon dioxide. That's all there is to burn globally if we want to have 2/3 chance of staying within 1.5 degrees. It's very, very straightforward in a sense. That's all the carbon we can afford to put in the atmosphere. The carbon in the atmosphere doesn't really care about the timescales of government bills. The carbon in the atmosphere doesn't really care about the intransigence of politicians. The carbon in the atmosphere doesn't care what year you were born in and whether you managed to update your knowledge or not. Actually, the science is very, very straightforward. That 420 billion tons is all that the whole world has to burn in terms of carbon if we want a decent world to live in. And so I did a little bit more maths and I asked myself, well, taking into account how many people there are in the UK and our historical responsibility for carbon emissions, how much would that leave the UK to burn between 2018 and the end of the century? And it came down to quite a small number, 2.5 billion tons. And then I looked at how much we're burning, particularly how much we're burning if we take into account, as Caroline said, all the consumption that comes from imports from overseas, where we don't even look at the carbon ourselves in our own accounts. And it turned out that was about 600 million tons a year. And then I did a little bit more maths and I figured out that means, and it was 2019 when I was doing it, that means we have to get rid of all the carbon that we're burning by 2025. Quite a shock, actually, because that was a year, in fact, that Extinction Rebellion had quite deliberately said, this is when we need to decarbonize by. This is when we need net zero by. And then around about the same time, the government sort of looked at the 1.5 degree report and said, well, let's adjust the Climate Act a little bit. And they came out with a net zero target for 2050. 2050 is too late. And that's exactly the point of people like Greta Thunberg. That's exactly the point of the kids on the street in Fridays for the Future. That's exactly the point that Extinction Rebellion is making. Tell the truth. The truth is we can't afford to burn carbon beyond about 2025. And that means a faster transition than anyone has talked about. It means taking it seriously, act as though it were true. And that is the challenge that this bill puts before Parliament. It is scientifically valid, it has integrity, it has responsibility, and it is the basis for a sensible legislation that would put us back into a place where we could hold our heads high and say we are taking moral responsibility for the damage we've caused to the planet.
This century, let's just look only at the last 20 years. This century has begun with repeated crises, be it a financial meltdown, the ecological and climate breakdown that we live in, and right now the COVID lockdown that's being endured worldwide. What strikes me is that these crises emerge from the very systems that we create. They emerge from our endless expansionism, whether it's the endless expanding of financial markets that then collapse on themselves, or humanity's endless expansion of use of fossil fuels and indeed of industrial capacity, or our endless expansion into wild places and our endless flying and interconnectivity. These crises are the boomerang effects of that way of living. So the goal here is to leave no one falling short on the essentials of life in the hole in the middle of that donut, without food, water, healthcare, education, housing. I can say these with conviction because the world's governments have already agreed that every person in the world has a claim to meeting every one of these social essentials. So leave no one in the hole. Get them over that social foundation. This is human rights. But we must add to that now 21st century knowledge that at the same time we can't overshoot that ecological ceiling, because then we put so much pressure on our life supporting systems of our planet. We break them down. We cause climate breakdown. We acidify our oceans. We create a hole in the ozone layer. These are, of course, the planetary boundaries whose recognition is just a decade old, which is astounding, that we are so young in understanding our deep interconnectedness upon each other and with the rest of the living world. But now we understand it. Now we know it. We can't unknow it, and we must act on it. As Tim says, once this knowledge comes, we must update our commitments and our actions and our legislation to reflect it. The goal is to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. It's very different from the 20th century goal of endless growth. It's about thriving in balance, and that changes everything. Right now, we are so far from thriving in balance. We are falling short on the essentials of life for billions of people worldwide. And we are already in overshoot on multiple planetary boundaries, especially you can see here on climate breakdown, on excessive fertilizer use, land conversion, and biodiversity loss, the breakdown of the web of life. These overshoots show us the climate and ecological crisis that we're in. So we, humanity, have to take this as our collective selfie, to recognize this is who we are in these early days of the 21st century. And our job now is one that no generation before us even tried to do, which is to meet the needs of all people for the first time in human history, while already coming back within planetary boundaries. We would be insane if we thought last century's economic theories or governmental policies or business models would do anything to solve this problem, because they were not designed to take this on. We have to come up with designs and ambition and courage of our own and these times to take on this challenge that we're the first generation to fully see. But of course, much policy happens at the national level. So let me bring it down. Here are 3 nations, done some brilliant research done by researchers at Leeds University. You can see the website at the bottom. I invite you to go and explore. 3 very different countries on the spectrum. Let's start with Rwanda. Massively falling short on meeting people's essential needs. That red deprivation must be eliminated to leave nobody falling short on the essentials of life in Rwanda, but well within their fair share of planetary boundaries, hardly putting any pressure on this planet. Brazil in the middle, like many countries like China and many middle incomes, both significantly falling short on the essentials of life, but already in overshoot, a double whammy of meeting its people's needs while already coming back within planetary boundaries. And then the UK. We are the same. We look very similar to nearly all high income countries, except let's note that as one of the richest countries in the world, we should be completely filling in that center circle blue. There should be no red deprivation, but there is because of inequalities in the UK. But we are massively in overshoot on those planetary boundaries. And by the way, they go way, way, way beyond that dotted line. Let's be clear that that overshoot isn't just resource use within the UK, it's all the resource embedded in our consumption of imports from overseas, the emissions, the material footprint, the water, the fertilizer, the land use, the timber. We claim it and recognize it's our consumption impact here. How can the UK be a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? Now you can hear in there's a social question and an ecological question. There's a local question and a global question. This breaks down into 4 questions, and this is the last big thing I want to share. And I invite us all to reflect on what this means for us as the UK right now at the start of this decade. What would it mean for the people of the UK to thrive? Who are we in our diversity and our values and our aspirations? And what would it mean for us all to thrive and to thrive as we make this transformational journey to where we already know we need to go? What would it mean for the UK to thrive within its natural habitat? Look at this phenomenally beautiful set of islands. And we know they are desperately depleted. What would it mean to restore the beautiful lands that we call home? To regenerate the soils and the peatlands, to rewild nature, to bring back the woodland, to bring back British wildlife, to allow Earth's ecosystems to return to the genius and the generosity that nature has when we allow her space and her full generous performance. So how do we restore that? Now, these 2 here are local aspiration. This is to be a thriving people in a thriving place, to make the UK a beautiful, brilliant place to live, but it's only half the story. We have to always put local aspiration in the context of global responsibility, because we know that every nation is embedded in a web of relationships of drawing materials and embedded in relationships of supply chains worldwide. So we must ask, what would it mean for the UK to respect the health of the whole planet? To ensure that our way of life is not deforesting the Amazon, is not destroying landscapes, is not fishing empty the sea. How do we do that without putting our carbon into the atmosphere? No matter where it's released in the world, if it's in products that are consumed here, we take responsibility for that footprint. So how do we come back within planetary boundaries? And think of the supply chains of food and clothing and electronics and consumer goods and construction materials, all the materials that are embodied in that. We must bring that within planetary boundaries and still think of those supply chains. And now think of the people who work in those supply chains. And we must ask ourselves, how can the UK respect the well-being of people worldwide, who pick and pack our fruit, who stitch and sew our clothes, who dig and transport the construction materials and then take the waste and unpack and dispose of it. The people and the communities worldwide who are impacted by the way that we live in the UK. So this is the question that I believe all ambitious towns and cities and communities and nations and communities of nations must ask themselves. And what I like about the CEE Bill is that it invites us to ask these questions and to answer them in legislation. It invites us to ask, what would it mean to restore the lands of the UK and to ensure that we do that? It invites us to ask, how do we live within the means of the planet and tackle the climate and ecological emergency, respecting our long history of impact and our first responsibility to move? And it invites us to ask, what would it mean to do so with a just transition for people who live in the UK and for people we affect worldwide? Is it complex? Of course it's complex. The 21st century is complex. And if we don't approach complex issues with a mindset that recognizes that, we will fail at the first hurdle. So for me, this is the question, and that is why I'm here in full support of the CEE Bill. Thank you.
I want to use this opportunity then to bring a global perspective, but actually not a global perspective, if I might, but bring a specifically African perspective to this debate rooted in a global South frame. I think listening to this conversation, it's important from an African perspective, we say very loudly that the way Africa is framed in these conversations, especially by the UK government, and when Tony Blair used to say, Africa is a scar on the conscience of humanity, as Africans, we looked and we said, actually, no, if you want to put it in those terms, Europe is actually a scar on the conscience of humanity, because Europe gave us colonialism, slavery, fossil fuels, and a whole bunch of other things. And so what we want to assert, this view that Africa is a poor, desperate continent, is to continuously remind the world that Africa is the richest continent underneath the ground, and that's precisely why we are one of the poorest continents above the ground. And do not think there is not a relationship between the legacies of slavery, colonialism, and the fossil fuel industrial complex that we have. It's very important that people recognize that when slavery ended, right, slavery, part of why slavery was able to end as far as the power brokers of that time were concerned, was because they could replace that cheap labor with fossil fuel driven, driving the economy. And we rather put our faith in the British people, who obviously are operating in a very complex political system, and the first past the post reality means that you constantly get governments in the UK as well as in other places that have 33% mandates, and we call that democracy. And all of these things must be put on the table right now if we are going to actually have the kinds of changes. And therefore, this CEE bill is a recognition that the current politics is not working. Those of us, like myself, who've been activists for 40 years, unfortunately, that's true. What do we have to show for it? If we are brutally honest right now, we must say we have failed and we are failing, and that the voices that are coming from the street right now, especially from young people, are the voices that we actually need to take much more seriously. We also have to recognize that the reality in the world today is not that we just have climate injustice, but we also have, in the sense that the places in the world which contributed most to the problem are not the places in the world that are facing the most brutal and the first impacts of climate change. They're happening in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. Yes, there are forest fires now in Australia and California, which is tragic. But you know what's more tragic for us? I want to put it bluntly. So now that white people are being affected, there seems to be more media coverage and so on. And we have to confront that for Britain to get things right moving forward, it must confront its legacy of crimes against humanity. And let's be very blunt. When we look at the optimism of the moment, right? For Africans Rising, we see a connection between racial injustice, environmental injustice, and other forms of injustice intersecting. We don't see them as silos standing on their own. That the biggest problem that we have today in the world from an economic perspective and a health perspective, the biggest disease is not affluent COVID that we face. The biggest disease that humanity faces is a disease that we can call affluenza, which is a pathological illness that a good, meaningful, decent life comes from more and more and more and more material consumption. And unless we recognize that our whole economic system is built on an absolute lie, right, of a calculation called GDP, right, which is a measurement of wealth, right, which is an absolutely useless definition for today, if ever it was. So you go and chop down an entire forest, it's a positive tick on GDP. Some of you might know that I was 6 years the head of Greenpeace International between 2009 and 2016. And, you know, in that role, as a person from the Global South, I had such a difficult time with governments in the Global South, right? Because we had a policy of saying, you know, the common and differentiated responsibilities, because we said all countries have to take action. Of course, there are some differentiated responsibilities, so those that carry a greater historical burden should do more. But it was so difficult. I remember speaking with after the Copenhagen collapsed, I was in China meeting with the head of the Chinese climate negotiation, was the vice minister of planning. And he basically said, listen, Minister Zay, his name was, he said, see, I agree with everything you all are saying. I understand the climate science, but explain to me, how do I go to my bosses up there, right, in the Politburo, the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and say to them, you have to get off coal, when the countries that built the economy, like the United States, are still continuing with coal and are not stopping. This was in 2009, okay? And so let's understand that if the countries that historically built the economies on dirty energy don't do something really bold, ambitious, and so on, it makes it really difficult to get our countries in the Global South to bypass the dirty energy route in terms of development. So I want to end by saying that this CEE bill has the possibility of inspiring a new kind of activism, a new kind of participation through these citizens' assemblies. There are going to be a lot of people who are going to scoff at it, including a lot of people from mainstream civil society, right? But I encourage you to actually innovate along these ways, because other things are not working, and therefore we have to have the courage to actually think differently. I want to end with the words of Martin Luther King to just inspire us. Speaking in the mid-1960s, he said, "My friends, as I come to the end of my speech, I want to note that in the field of modern child psychology, there's a very dominant term called maladjusted. Now, all of us want to be well-adjusted and not suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But my friends, I say to you, there are certain things in our world that are so unjust and immoral that good, decent people should refuse to be well-adjusted to." He went on to say, "I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry, racial discrimination." And on the economy, very important, he said, "I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society." So I say to you, the climate crisis is not a crisis in isolation. The climate crisis is fundamentally an economic crisis. It's a crisis of greed. It's a crisis of overconsumption. And unless we have the courage and the strength to say that we have to transform our economic system and to get ordinary people into the conversation to push for it, I think we are also kidding ourselves about whether we can deliver the kinds of massive seismic changes that we need to make in this decade, which I would end by saying is probably the most consequential decade in human history.
Tim, why do we need this bill when we have a Climate Change Act, a government's environment bill, and proposed legislation on supply chains and deforestation?
Well, I guess that was the thrust of what I was trying to say. In a sense, we need it because the science has changed, our understanding has changed. We did nothing for too long, and now we are in a state of emergency. Emergency is different from the situation that we were in perhaps 20 years ago, 30 years ago when we first had the knowledge. Emergency means you have to act now, and acting now means creating the legislative framework to do that. That's what the bill does. And it insists on scientific robustness, it insists on fairness and responsibility, it insists on integrity rather than instrumentalism. It makes clear that we don't solve one problem by mass plantation forestry, that we have to respect nature as well as the climate, and nothing we have in legislation so far achieves that. That's why this bill is needed.
How will this bill prevent this siloing that we have, where we take one tiny step forward in one department and the next department rushes backwards several steps?
I think it will do that by bringing the future into the present. I think it will do that by bringing our responsibility to the future into the present. If you think that environmental targets are things that you can achieve in 2050, this administration is not going to do anything about it. No administration is going to do anything seriously, urgently about something that it thinks might happen in 2050. The science tells us that's not the case. The science tells us now is the time to act. And when you look at the scale at which you must act, then you begin to realize all the places in the economy, in society, that you have to take actions. And actually, you know, one of the most encouraging things out of a year of tragedy and loss is an understanding of the speed with which government can act when it needs to act. This is the same kind of emergency. Its timescales are very, very similar, and its effects may be even more devastating. So I think that's exactly what the bill puts front and center and calls government's attention to.
There are lessons from this horrible experience of COVID, in the sense that governments can act in the public interest when the political will is there. And they've done things that we could never imagine, like writing off 13 billion of NHS debt, or paying the salaries of loads of people in the country, or renationalising rail, or whatever. And I guess I would just want us to give ourselves some kind of hope from that sometimes things can happen very fast. You know, things that you imagine incremental change is never going to get us there fast enough, but sometimes there can be a tipping point, and sometimes the magic money tree is found at the bottom of the garden, and so forth. So that's just as a way of context. And what I want people to do, I guess, is what people have already said. I want people to lobby their MPs, and if their MPs are people who are saying, I can't act because I'm on the front bench or whatever, then challenge that. If you still can't get through to your local MP, then try and organise, as I think Kumi was saying, you know, some kind of local meeting in your constituency, and get the MP there if you can. And I'm sure that, you know, through the campaign, we would be happy to offer speakers as well, if that's useful. Let's build this grassroots bottom-up campaign that Kumi spoke so eloquently about, because that is where, in a sense, pressure gets brought. If we're trying to get something through Parliament, then there's 650 MPs, all of whom need to be persuaded. And don't ever think that you're contacting an MP doesn't make a difference, because although it might not do in the short term, it's part of that pressure that builds and can ultimately make a difference.
If taking the knee was the most powerful symbolic communication that resonated with millions of people, which didn't require thick policy documents and big books and so on, what would be the climate equivalent of taking a knee? Because part of the challenge we have with climate is that those of us who have been involved in it talk as if we are talking to each other all the time, right? We don't realize how big a gap of knowledge by design it's been, that the majority of people won't have the level of nuance that those that have the privilege of being educated or being in movements where they're working on it. So I think for the climate bill to succeed, climate emergency bill to succeed, it must be, the approach to it needs to be popular in orientation. And I'll end with what might sound like a naughty idea, but if I was in the Alliance right now, what I would do is convene 100 young, creative people, say, some of you are going to deliver, your job is to deliver memes, creative, funny, bold memes that explodes this campaign and conversation. Get some of them to develop a dance for the CEE Bill, get some of them to develop a song for the CEE Bill, because let me just tell you, we can sit here and talk till the cows come home in a language that we think everybody is talking, but let's be honest, there's not even 95% of people in the UK who, if they watch or in the world, watch this conversation, would understand everything that we said. And And politics and campaigning and mobilization is not about projecting our consciousness on the people. It's about humbling ourselves, understanding where people are, and bringing them towards us in a respectful way with dignity and integrity.
Point. I think I'd like some of those young activists, or they don't even have to be young, they could be any activists anywhere, really building out this kind of idea of a strategy. What do we need at this point in time?
Yeah.
We need names on the bill. And that can be a very strategic activity. You know, instead of a whiteboard, I've been watching CNN all week, of course, all last week, and looking at those wonderful tools they have, you know, looking at the swing states. We need the swing politicians, and we need to focus on the swing politicians. We need to go down that board name by name, bringing them in. We need to ask, which does that person who signed that bill, who do they know, who do they talk to, what is their circle of friends and collaborators, and build those names on the bill name by name. And I think that's, you know, it's a very practical, very strategic task. And we have this huge resource actually that has come out on the streets in the last year of young people who understand the dynamics of online, and in ways, in fact, that, you know, the politics of the past doesn't necessarily understand it. And that's what we should bring to this occasion. That's what Caroline needs. That's what the bill needs. And that's what will turn it into an act.
I love that idea that we have a list, a parliamentary list, everything your MP has said about climate, how they voted, how many letters they've got, how they have replied to the letters, a whole sort of climate dossier, and all on every single person. Great,
Absolutely.
Let's do it.
Can this become a piece of legacy legislation? Can we appeal to the legacy, the people who are beginning to think, what is the legacy of my life?
Yeah.
Whether it's my legacy at work, my legacy to my grandchildren, my legacy in the community of which I'm a part. This is a legacy of our generation that we will bequeath to the next. And so how could we appeal to those who are engaging in that legacy, that long-term thinking, and make this a piece of legacy legislation? And I'll say one more thing. It's an emergency and we are against climate breakdown, but we always must remember to articulate what we're for, with play, with joy, with the beauty of a living world, because knowing what you're for is so much more inspiring than only knowing what you're against. And that's what makes people show up with fun and with music and with dance. So let's remember what we're for, a thriving planet and thriving people. It's so possible. And as Kumi began, this is the decade in which we determined that we're going to make it happen.